It was Halloween night, and the world felt alive. The air was crisp, the leaves rustled underfoot, and every porch on the block was lit with carved pumpkins grinning in eerie silence. My wife, Laura, and I had dressed the kids in their costumes, our youngest as a ghost and our eldest as a skeleton. They were buzzing with excitement as we drove to my brother Dan's house for his annual Halloween bash. Dan always went all out for these things. His house looked like it had been plucked straight out of a horror movie: fog machines, life-size skeletons, and a sound system that blasted screams and ominous laughter into the night. The kids adored it, and honestly, I couldn't help but get caught up in the magic of it all. Dan had always been the fun, larger-than-life guy in the family, and his parties were a reflection of that. The night started innocently enough. Laura mingled with the other parents while I kept an eye on the kids as they ran around the yard, sugar-fueled and wild. Dan was in his element, handing out drinks, cracking jokes, and entertaining the crowd. At one point, he pulled me aside, beer in hand, and gave me a big brotherly slap on the back. "You're lucky to have a woman like Laura," he said, his voice warm and just slightly slurred. "She's a gem." I laughed and nodded, agreeing with him. Laura and I had our ups and downs, but I loved her. She was beautiful, smart, and charismatic. She could light up a room with just a smile. Watching her that night, chatting and laughing with everyone, I felt a swell of pride. She really was amazing. As the night wore on, I noticed something odd. Laura and Dan were talking, nothing unusual about that, but the way they leaned in toward each other, the way they laughed a little too hard at each other's jokes, set off a faint alarm in the back of my mind. I told myself I was imagining things. It was just the atmosphere, the drinks, the costumes. People were naturally a little more playful on Halloween. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. When it was time to head home, Laura seemed reluctant to leave. She insisted on helping Dan clean up, but I convinced her we needed to get the kids to bed. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Dan standing on the porch, watching us go with a strange look on his face. I told myself it was nothing. But it wasn't. The night's unease lingered with me over the next few weeks. Laura began suggesting we visit Dan more often, something she'd never done before. I brushed it off at first, but then there were the times she'd go over without me, claiming she wanted to help him with errands or projects around the house. It didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on why. It wasn't until our eldest son, Mark, came to me one evening that the puzzle pieces started falling into place. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "I think I saw Mom's car near Uncle Dan's house today. I was driving back from practice, and it was parked on the side street." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice calm but my heart racing. Mark nodded, looking troubled. "I didn't stop or anything, but yeah, I'm sure." I thanked him and sent him off to bed, my mind a storm of thoughts. Laura hadn't mentioned going to Dan's that day. In fact, she told me she was running errands across town. My gut churned with a mix of anger and dread, but I pushed it down. I needed to be sure before I said anything. The Halloween memories I had cherished so much now felt like they were taunting me. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't escape the sinking feeling that my world was about to fall apart. The following morning, the unease that had taken root in my chest hardened into determination. I couldn't let this gnaw at me any longer without answers. Mark's words replayed in my head as I watched Laura move through our morning routine like nothing was wrong. She kissed me on the cheek before leaving for her yoga class, her smile warm and disarming. But all I could think was, is she lying? I didn't ask her about the car. Not yet. If I confronted her without proof, I knew she'd deny it, twist it, make me feel crazy for even bringing it up. I needed to see it for myself. So I started paying closer attention. That week, I noticed the little things I'd been ignoring for too long. The way Laura was glued to her phone, smiling faintly at messages she'd never share. The nights when she'd stay out later than usual, claiming she'd been stuck in traffic or caught up with a friend. I even caught her in a few small lies. She told me she had been running errands in the opposite direction from where Mark had seen her car. My heart ached with every new inconsistency, but I stayed quiet. Instead, I started keeping track of her movements. I downloaded a location sharing app onto her phone under the guise of family safety. She didn't seem to think twice when I suggested it, probably assuming it was just another one of my protective dad habits. And for a while, her movements were exactly what she said they were. Yoga class, the grocery store, the gym. I felt almost relieved. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe Mark had just been mistaken. But then came Thursday. I was working from home when I got the notification. Laura's location had shifted to an unfamiliar address across town, an address that turned out to be dangerously close to Dan's house. My stomach tightened as I stared at the app, watching her dot move closer to his street and then stop. I grabbed my keys without thinking and drove as fast as I could, fueled by a mix of adrenaline and dread. The closer I got to Dan's neighborhood, the heavier my chest felt. What was I about to find? I parked a block away, staying out of sight, and made my way toward his house on foot. It felt like every step I took dragged me closer to something I could never undo. When I reached his street, I spotted her car parked just around the corner, hidden from view but unmistakably hers. My heart pounded as I approached Dan's house, keeping to the shadows. I didn't want to knock or ring the bell. I wasn't ready to confront anything yet. Instead, I crept around the side, finding a spot where I could see through a gap in the blinds. And there they were. Laura was sitting on Dan's couch, her hand resting casually on his arm as they talked. They weren't doing anything overtly suspicious, but the ease between them was undeniable. It was the way they looked at each other, the way she laughed just a little too freely at whatever he'd said. It was intimacy, plain and simple, the kind you don't share with a brother-in-law. I stayed there, frozen, my breath catching in my throat. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. How long had this been going on? Was it emotional or physical? Did she love him, or was it just sex? The worst part was that I didn't have answers, just the raw, gut-wrenching sight of my wife and my brother together in a way that they shouldn't be. When I finally made it back to the car, my hands were trembling. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to figure out what to do. I could confront her. I could storm into the house and demand answers. But a part of me held back. Maybe I needed more. Maybe I needed to be absolutely sure before I turned my life, and my kids' lives, upside down. That night, Laura came home like nothing was wrong. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and even brought me my favorite takeout for dinner. I couldn't decide if it was guilt or just habit, but it sickened me either way. As we lay in bed, her back turned to me, I stared at the ceiling and felt the cracks in my marriage widen. She thought I didn't know. She thought she could keep this hidden. But I wasn't going to let her. The day after I caught them, I felt like I was living in a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. I went through the motions of my daily routine, trying to act normal for the kids' sake, but inside, I was unraveling. Every time Laura smiled at me or asked about my plans for the day, I had to force myself not to snap. I needed a plan. If what I saw at Dan's house was just the tip of the iceberg, I needed proof of the rest. Proof for myself, for my sanity, and maybe for a divorce lawyer. So, I set my emotions aside and got to work. The first step was getting a camera. I ordered one of those discreet, Wi-Fi-enabled models that could fit in the palm of my hand. It wasn't cheap, but I didn't care. I needed to know. When the camera arrived, I set it up in the car, Laura's car. I waited until late one night when she was asleep, then slipped out to the garage and tucked it into the pocket of the driver's side door, carefully adjusting the angle so it could capture the inside of the vehicle. If she was sneaking around with Dan or anyone else, I'd catch it. Then I waited. For the next few days, I monitored her movements like a hawk. The location app I'd installed showed her usual routine: yoga, grocery shopping, errands. Nothing out of the ordinary. I started to doubt myself, to wonder if I'd misread everything. Maybe the visit to Dan's house was innocent. Maybe their closeness was just a misunderstanding. But then, the camera delivered its first bombshell. It was a Friday evening when I retrieved the footage. I waited until Laura was in the shower, then slipped into the garage and pulled the memory card from the camera. Back in my office, I loaded the video onto my laptop, my heart pounding as I clicked through the clips. Most of it was mundane: Laura driving, adjusting the radio, talking to herself. But then came a clip that made my blood run cold. Laura was parked somewhere, the camera catching only a partial view of a house I didn't recognize. The passenger door opened, and Dan climbed into the car. For a moment, they just sat there, talking, their voices too faint for the camera to pick up. Then, Dan reached over and placed his hand on her thigh. She didn't pull away. My vision blurred with rage as I watched the scene unfold. Dan leaned in closer, his lips brushing against hers, and she let him. It wasn't a brief, hesitant kiss, it was deliberate, full of the kind of passion I hadn't seen from her in years. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling. There it was, the proof I needed. My wife and my brother. That night, I couldn't look at her without imagining Dan's hands on her, his lips on hers. I slept on the couch, claiming I had a headache. Laura didn't press me. The next morning, as I tried to figure out my next move, Mark approached me again. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "I saw Mom's car at Uncle Dan's house yesterday. It was parked out front for a while." I froze. Mark was a good kid, but he wasn't stupid. I could see the worry in his eyes, the way he hesitated like he wasn't sure if he should even be telling me. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, keeping my voice calm even though my chest felt like it was about to explode. He nodded, then shuffled off to his room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Laura had no idea how close she was to being exposed. But I still wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. There was one more thing I needed to do before I blew the whole thing wide open. I needed to follow her. That Sunday, Laura told me she was heading out to run errands. She kissed me goodbye, grabbed her purse, and left with a breezy smile that made me want to throw something. As soon as the door closed behind her, I grabbed my keys and followed. I'd never tailed anyone before, and my heart raced with the thrill and anxiety of what I was about to do. I stayed far enough behind her that she wouldn't notice me, weaving through traffic as her car took a familiar route toward the grocery store. For a moment, I almost turned back. Maybe this really was just an innocent trip. Maybe I was making it all up in my head. But then, she passed the grocery store without stopping. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my pulse quickening as her car turned down a residential street. It wasn't Dan's neighborhood, not yet, but it wasn't anywhere she'd mentioned going. She parked in front of a small, nondescript house and went inside without looking around. I parked a few houses down and watched, waiting. Minutes passed, and the stillness of the street felt suffocating. The longer I waited, the more my mind filled with dark scenarios. Was Dan already inside? Was this some kind of secret hideaway? When the front door opened again, it wasn't Laura who emerged. It was Dan. He stood on the porch for a moment, glancing around before pulling his phone from his pocket. My stomach churned as he disappeared back inside, leaving no doubt in my mind about why he was there. I stayed parked for nearly an hour, torn between charging up to the house and demanding answers or waiting for her to leave. I didn't want a scene, not yet. I needed her to think she was still in control, still fooling me. Finally, the door opened, and Laura came out, her hair slightly disheveled. Dan stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, and they exchanged a look that felt like a dagger to my chest. She got into her car and drove off, as if nothing had happened. I didn't follow her this time. Instead, I stayed parked, staring at Dan's house with a mix of fury and disbelief. That night, Laura was her usual cheerful self, chatting about the errands she'd run and asking me if I needed anything. I played along, smiling and nodding while I mentally replayed every detail of what I'd seen. But the facade was starting to crack. "I saw Dan today," she mentioned casually, almost as an afterthought. "He was at the store while I was out. It was nice catching up." It took every ounce of self-control not to confront her right then and there. The audacity of her lie, the ease with which she delivered it, it was like she'd done this 1,000 times before. "That's nice," I said, keeping my tone neutral. How's he doing? Good, she replied, not missing a beat. Busy as usual. I nodded, forcing a smile. Inside, I was screaming. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out what to do next. The evidence was piling up, but I still wasn't sure how to confront her without destroying our family. Mark's words echoed in my mind, his quiet worry about seeing her car near Dan's house. He was old enough to understand that something wasn't right, but I didn't want to drag him or his younger sibling into this mess. I spent the day going through the footage from the car camera, looking for anything else that might solidify my suspicions. Most of it was mundane, but the clip of Dan climbing into her car played on a loop in my head. When I picked up the kids from school that afternoon, Mark asked if everything was okay. You've been acting weird lately, he said, his tone cautious. I'm fine, I lied. Just tired. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. That night, as Laura slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and made my decision. I wasn't going to wait any longer. I didn't sleep at all that night. My mind was a storm of emotions, rage, betrayal, sadness, but beneath it all, a cold resolve had taken hold. I couldn't keep living like this, pretending not to see what was right in front of me. When Laura left for work the next morning, I waited until the kids were at school, then drove straight to Dan's house. He answered the door with his usual laid-back grin, but it froze on his face when he saw me standing there. Ryan, he said, his voice uneven. What's up? I didn't waste time with pleasantries. We need to talk. He hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone else to intervene. Sure. Come in. I stepped inside, the familiar smell of his house turning my stomach. It used to feel like a second home to me, but now it felt foreign and wrong. Dan gestured for me to sit, but I stayed standing, my fists clenched at my sides. I know about you and Laura, I said, cutting straight to the point. Dan's face went pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of the silence pressing down on us like a physical force. What are you talking about? He finally stammered, his voice shaky. Don't play dumb, I snapped. I've seen the way you look at each other. I've seen her car at your house. And I have video of you two together. His eyes widened, and he took a step back. Ryan, it's not what you think. Save it, I interrupted. I don't want your excuses. I want the truth. Dan ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. Okay, he said quietly. You're right. Something's been going on. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I'd already known. Hearing him admit it made it real in a way that nothing else had. How long? I demanded, my voice trembling with barely restrained anger. Since the summer, he said, looking anywhere but at me. It just happened. I laughed bitterly. It just happened? That's the best you can do? Dan flinched at the venom in my voice but didn't respond. And what about her? I pressed. Does she love you? He hesitated, then shook his head. No. It's not like that. She said she still loves you, Ryan. She just... I don't know. She said she was confused. Confused, I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I wanted to hit him, to scream, to make him feel the same pain he'd inflicted on me. But I held back. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. You've destroyed everything, I said quietly, my voice shaking with rage. Our family, our trust, everything. And for what? A fling? A few months of sneaking around? Dan hung his head, his face etched with shame. I'm sorry, Ryan. I never meant for it to get this far. Yeah? I shot back. Well, it did. And now you're going to live with the consequences. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. When Laura came home that evening, she knew something was wrong. I couldn't hide the tension in my face, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. What's going on? She asked cautiously as we sat down for dinner. I stared at her for a long moment, watching her squirm under my gaze. She looked so innocent, so oblivious, but I knew better now. Nothing, I said finally, forcing a smile. Just a long day. She nodded, relief flickering across her face. But the real confrontation was coming. The moment I decided to confront Laura, the house seemed to hold its breath. It was late, the kids asleep in their rooms, the only sound the quiet hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Laura sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely unaware that the life she had so carefully constructed was about to collapse. I walked into the room, holding my laptop in one hand and my phone in the other. Laura, I said, my voice steady, though my chest was tight with adrenaline. We need to talk. She looked up, her brow furrowing at the seriousness in my tone. What is it? I sat across from her, setting the laptop on the coffee table between us. For a moment, I didn't say anything, just stared at her, studying the face I thought I knew better than anyone. You've been lying to me, I said finally. Her expression shifted, confusion, then nervousness, then a flicker of something else. What are you talking about? I opened the laptop and played the clip of her and Dan in the car. Her laughter, his hand on her thigh, their kiss, it all played out in stark clarity on the screen. Her face strained of color. Ryan, Don't, I said sharply, cutting her off. Don't insult me with excuses or lies. I've seen enough. I know what's been going on between you and Dan. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her hands trembling as she set her phone aside. How long? I demanded, my voice cold. Ryan, please, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I can explain. How long? I repeated, louder this time. Since July, she said quietly, her voice breaking. The confirmation felt like a knife twisting in my gut, but I refused to let her see how much it hurt. Why? I asked, my voice low and raw. Why him? My brother of all people? I don't know, she said, wiping at her tears. It started with little things. Talking more, spending time together. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the silence. That's the second time I've heard that excuse today. You and Dan really have this rehearsed, don't you? Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. You talked to Dan? Of course I talked to him. I snapped. Did you think this would stay a secret forever? That I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't figure it out? I didn't want to hurt you, she said, her voice trembling. I love you, Ryan. I made a mistake, but I still love you. Love me? I spat, the words tasting like bile. You don't love me. If you did, this never would have happened. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the sight of her touch making my skin crawl. I want to know everything, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. Every detail. No more lies. No more half-truths. Tell me everything, Laura, or this is over right now. For a moment, I thought she might refuse, but then she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. It started at the 4th of July barbecue, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You were busy with the kids, and Dan and I ended up talking. We were just catching up, but I don't know. Something shifted. After that, we started texting more. Meeting up for coffee. It felt innocent at first, but then you started sleeping together. I finished for her, my voice dripping with bitterness. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. It wasn't just about the sex, Ryan. It was, I don't know, an escape maybe? Things between us haven't been the same for a while, and I. Don't you dare blame this on me, I said, my voice rising. Don't you dare try to justify this by saying we had problems. Every couple has problems, Laura. But not every couple destroys their family over them. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. The sight of her tears didn't move me, not this time. You've destroyed everything, I said quietly, my voice shaking. Our trust, our marriage, our family. Do you even realize what you've done? She looked up at me, her face red and tear-streaked. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this," she pleaded. "Please, Ryan. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family." I stood, unable to sit there any longer. "It's too late for that, Laura," I said, turning toward the stairs. "You already have." The morning after our confrontation, the house felt like a tomb. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and even the kids seemed to sense something was wrong. Laura kept to herself, avoiding eye contact as she moved around the kitchen, making breakfast for the kids. I sat at the table, silent, watching her like a stranger. Mark, our eldest, glanced between us, his face etched with worry. "Are you and Mom okay?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "We're fine, buddy. Just grown-up stuff." It was a lie, and I hated myself for telling it, but I couldn't bring him into this, not yet. When Laura left to drop the kids at school, I sat in the quiet of the house, replaying the confrontation over and over in my head. Her tears, her excuses, her desperate pleas to fix what she'd broken. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think that this was just a horrible mistake we could somehow move past. But the other part, the part that had watched her kiss my brother, had seen the lies written all over her face, knew better. I needed space. That afternoon, I took a drive. The road stretched endlessly before me, a winding path through the countryside that gave me time to think, or at least try to. Every mile felt heavier than the last, the weight of the situation pressing down on my chest. At one point, I pulled over to the side of the road and just sat there, staring out at the fields stretching into the distance. I thought about the kids, about how this would affect them if it came out. They adored their mother, and the thought of shattering their image of her made me feel sick. But I couldn't keep this secret forever. When I got home, Laura was waiting for me in the living room. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "We need to talk," she said softly, wringing her hands. "I thought we already did," I replied, my voice cold. She shook her head, stepping closer. "No, Ryan. I need you to understand I love you. I've always loved you. What happened with Dan? It wasn't about you. It was about me. I've been so lost, and I didn't know how to tell you." "So you told my brother instead?" I shot back, my voice rising. Her lip trembled, but she didn't back down. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want." I stared at her, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, sadness, all of it crashed over me in waves. "I don't know if this is fixable," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't just cheat, Laura. You broke something I don't know how to put back together." She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "Please, Ryan. Just give me a chance. For the kids, if nothing else." The mention of the kids hit me like a gut punch. I thought of Mark, of the way he looked at me that morning, full of quiet worry. How could I do this to him? To them? "I don't know," I said, standing. "I need time to think." And with that, I left the room, leaving her sobbing behind me. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of the situation pressed down on me like a physical force. Laura slept on the couch downstairs, but even the distance between us wasn't enough to quiet my thoughts. I had no idea what I was going to do. The next morning started with the usual sounds of cereal bowls clinking and the kids bickering about whose turn it was to control the TV. On the surface, everything looked normal, but beneath it all, the cracks were spreading. Laura and I barely exchanged words. Her face was etched with guilt, her movements careful, like she was walking on eggshells. I poured a cup of coffee and tried to focus on the newspaper, but the words swam before my eyes. My mind was too preoccupied, spiraling into dark places. That's when Mark's voice pulled me back to reality. "Dad?" he asked, standing hesitantly at the kitchen door. "Yeah, buddy?" I said, forcing a smile. He glanced toward the living room, where Laura was trying to coax our youngest into finishing breakfast, then lowered his voice. "Can we talk? Alone?" A flicker of unease crawled up my spine. Sure. Let's go to my office. Once we were inside, Mark closed the door and sat down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. He looked nervous, but determined, like he'd been carrying a secret too big for him to handle. What's on your mind? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He hesitated, then blurted. I saw Mom's car at Uncle Dan's house again. Yesterday, when I was coming back from practice. My chest tightened. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, the way his voice wavered like he already knew something was wrong but didn't want to admit it. I know, I said carefully. His head snapped up, his eyes wide. You know? Then why hasn't anyone said anything? Is Mom okay? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Your mom and I are going through some stuff right now. It's complicated. Mark frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. Does it have to do with Uncle Dan? I stared at him, caught between the need to protect him from the truth and the urge to be honest. But before I could answer, he continued. I'm not stupid, Dad. I saw the way they looked at each other at Halloween. And now she's always going to his house. He trailed off, his face clouded with confusion and anger. I felt my throat tighten. Mark was only 15, but he was perceptive, too perceptive. Listen, I said, leaning forward. This is between your mom and me. I know it's hard, but I don't want you to worry about it, okay? We'll figure it out. Mark didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. Does this mean? He hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. You're going to leave her? The question hit me like a freight train. It was the first time the possibility of divorce had been spoken out loud, and hearing it from my son made it all the more real. I don't know, I admitted, my voice heavy with emotion. But whatever happens, I promise you and your brother will always come first. Mark nodded again, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Okay. I pulled him into a hug, holding him tighter than I had in years. That afternoon, Laura and I sat down to talk again. The air between us was thick with tension, her eyes darting nervously as she waited for me to speak. Mark knows, I said bluntly. Her face crumpled, her hand flying to her mouth. What? What did he say? He saw your car at Dan's again. He's not stupid, Laura. He knows something's wrong. Tears filled her eyes as she shook her head. I never wanted this to affect the kids, she whispered. I thought I was being careful. Careful? I said, my voice rising. You were sneaking around with my brother. Did you think you could keep this hidden forever? That there wouldn't be consequences? She didn't respond, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I stood, pacing the room as anger and frustration bubbled to the surface. Do you even understand what you've done? You've put us in this impossible situation. The kids are going to be crushed when they find out the truth. I'll tell him, she said suddenly, her voice trembling. I'll tell Mark everything. He deserves to hear it from me. No, I said firmly. You've already done enough damage. I'll handle it. She looked at me, her expression a mix of guilt and defeat. Ryan, please, she whispered. Don't give up on us. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. The next few days felt like a slow march toward the inevitable. Mark avoided Laura, spending most of his time in his room or out with friends. Our youngest, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, still treated Laura like nothing was wrong, and the innocence in that was almost unbearable. I kept my distance, speaking to Laura only when necessary and keeping our conversations strictly about the kids or the house. But the tension in the air was impossible to ignore, like the house itself was cracking under the weight of our silence. Then, one evening, Mark came to me again, his face pale and set with determination. Dad, he said, I need to know the truth. I hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a physical force. The truth about what? About Mom. About Uncle Dan. About everything. I sat down heavily, gesturing for him to join me on the couch. Mark, this isn't something you need to worry about. I already am, he interrupted, his voice rising. I'm not a little kid, Dad. I know something's going on, and I don't want to be kept in the dark anymore. I stared at him, my heart breaking at the mix of anger and desperation in his eyes. He was right. He deserved the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Taking a deep breath, I said, "Okay. I'll tell you." I didn't sugarcoat it. I told him about Laura and Dan's affair, about the lies and the betrayal, about everything I'd discovered over the past few weeks. His expression shifted from shock to disbelief to anger, his fists clenching at his sides as I spoke. When I finished, he sat in stunned silence for a long moment. "How could she do this?" he finally said, his voice trembling. "How could Uncle Dan do this?" "I don't know," I admitted, my own voice heavy with emotion. "I've been asking myself the same thing." Mark shook his head, his face a mix of fury and sadness. "She lied to us. To you. To all of us." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But no matter what happens between your mom and me, she's still your mother. She loves you." He shrugged off my hand, his jaw tightening. "If she loved us, she wouldn't have done this." I didn't have an answer for that. Later that night, as I sat alone in my office, Laura knocked softly on the door. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice tentative. I gestured for her to come in, and she sat across from me, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Mark knows, doesn't he?" she asked. "Yes," I said simply. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," I replied. "He deserves that much." Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands, sobbing. "I've ruined everything," she whispered. I didn't argue. After a moment, she looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Ryan, I know I don't deserve it, but is there any chance we can fix this? For the kids?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at her. "I don't know, Laura. I honestly don't know." Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded, as if she'd expected the answer. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said quietly. "I'll go to therapy. I'll cut off all contact with Dan. I'll do anything." But her words felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to cling to something already broken. "I need time," I said finally. She nodded again, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Okay." As she left the room, I felt the weight of her words settle over me. Time. It was the only thing I had left. It was a week later when everything came crashing down. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point, and even our youngest had started asking questions about why I wasn't sleeping in the same room as Laura. I'd promised myself I'd take my time to figure things out, but life had other plans. That afternoon, as I worked from home, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the location sharing app I'd installed on Laura's phone. She was back at Dan's house. The anger that had been simmering for weeks erupted into a storm. She had promised me she'd cut all ties with him, had begged for another chance, and here she was, breaking that promise like it meant nothing. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to Dan's neighborhood, my mind a whirlwind of fury and resolve. When I pulled up, her car was in the driveway, just like before. I parked down the street and stormed toward the house, my footsteps heavy with purpose. This time, I didn't peek through the window. I didn't hesitate. I pounded on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet street. Dan answered, his face pale the moment he saw me. "Ryan, Shut up!" I snapped, pushing past him into the house. Laura stood in the living room, her face a mask of shock and panic. "Ryan, what are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice shaking with rage. "What the hell are you doing here, Laura? I thought we agreed you'd cut him off." She stammered, her words incoherent, but I didn't let her finish. "You lied to me," I said, my voice rising. "Again. You begged for another chance, and this is what you do? Sneaking around with my brother like I wouldn't find out. It's not what it looks like," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare," I growled. "Don't you dare insult me with that line. I'm done, Laura. I'm done with the lies, the excuses, all of it. Dan stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I turned to him, my fury spilling over. And you, I said, stepping toward him. You were supposed to be my brother. My family. How could you do this to me? To us? I'm sorry, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Sorry? I barked, my fists clenching at my sides. You think sorry is going to fix this? The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Laura sank onto the couch, sobbing into her hands, while Dan stood there, too cowardly to look me in the eye. This is over, I said finally, my voice cold and steady. You've made your choices, both of you. And now you'll live with the consequences. When I got home, Mark was waiting for me in the kitchen. Did you talk to her? He asked, his voice tight with concern. Yes, I said, my expression hard. It's over. He didn't ask what I meant, but the look on his face told me he understood. The next morning, I sat Laura down and told her I wanted a divorce. She didn't argue, didn't beg, just nodded, her face pale and drawn. For the sake of the kids, we agreed to keep things civil. We'd co-parent as best we could, but there was no salvaging what we'd had. Dan, as far as I was concerned, was dead to me. It's been 6 months since that day. The divorce is final, and the kids are adjusting as well as can be expected. Mark knows more than I wish he did, but he's been strong through it all. Laura and Dan? I don't know, and I don't care. What I do know is that I found peace in the silence they left behind. My life is different now, smaller, maybe, but mine. And that's enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.